We have just a small topic of conversation here and not a whole lot of time to cover it in. So I want to go ahead and get right to the big question that we've been tasked, and then depending on how things go, maybe move out from the specifics of the near term in Southeast Asia to some more general questions about the future of AI.
Of course.
So to start, we've been tasked with exploring the near-term implications, let's say a 5-year time horizon, of what you all see as the likely implications of artificial intelligence and robotics development as it plays out in Southeast Asia. Dr. Sutapa, could I start with your take?
Of course. First of all, thank you, Singularity University and all the sponsors who are, giving me to chair the panel with such an experts and the great minds. I'm quite starstruck actually. So I think looking into the 5 years time, right now we see a lot of automation of something that we used to feel that it has to be trained by human, like natural language processing. So in the next few years, I think we will see a lot of automation of that process, of that task. More specifically, I would say that nowadays when we talk about a manufacturer, when they have to change a product, they will spend 6 months or 12 months lead time reprogramming a machine to change the product line. One thing that is well developed in that area is a machine learning algorithm that helps the robot reprogramming themselves to change the new product line, so that bring down the lead time significantly. And I think from the government perspective, we'll see a lot more and more initiatives, particularly in the UK and Estonia, of a shared infrastructure that would help with digital transformations of the economy. And we can see that in the digital government initiative like the X Road or government cloud, for example. We would see quite a bit of that. The last thing that I want to emphasize is I believe that in Southeast Asia, we will start to see the trend that actually happened in the US right now, where the big company, big corporates with access to data and access to technical talents will accumulate the market power. We'll see that be replicated in Southeast Asia very soon.
Thank you. Dr. Jeng, what would you add to that? It sounds like a pretty reasonable assessment of what the likely developments are. I'd like to dig a little bit further into the implications and the consequences.
As a Chief Digital Officer also of CP Group, so I have a first glance of the region through our company, which cover Southeast Asia a lot. And we have some leadership position that in agriculture, that we use a lot of adoption of a robot, and also using camera AI analytics to do digital farming. To essentially, we will be the first to do through camera picture of pig to measure the weight of the pig. That's very, very unique, right? And we also will apply artificial intelligence to optimize smart farming, and so we use that a lot. And we also have retail convenience, which is very unique, that we have camera, CCTV, we can build a lot of AI analytics. So I can see some leadership position, but this region very much lagging behind China and US on e-commerce and O2O, right? So we have a lot to catch up. And this region is also a cash-oriented culture that we try to catch up with China or even US, right, in digital wallet. So we're making a lot of AI progress, right, on credit score and loan, so on. So that's something interesting as well. And on healthcare, also this region is unique that is regulatorily more friendly. So we will be able to provide personalized and DNA sequencer using our retail stores, the ecosystem, and you leverage the regulatory friendly environment so we can create a better personalized healthcare, better public clinical procedure, right, in this region as well. With regulatory friendly environment for blockchain as well. And better privacy control. So I think there's a lot of potential for exponential growth in this region. And I certainly feel AI is sitting on the shoulder of giants, right? It's not by itself that fly, and it's not change. It will change everything, but it's not going to take over the world. So definitely agree with Dr. Bibi.
Okay, since you said something about whether or not AI would take over the world, we've kind of brought this sort of theme up again, and I'd like to return to something with the three of you that Nathaniel mentioned this morning. Nathaniel highlighted the emerging threat of baking some of the worst aspects of human decision-making into AI systems, some of our cognitive biases, some of our fallacious habits and reasoning, and also some of our poor usage of data sets that are not particularly well-groomed or well-suited to the task at hand. And I'm wondering if you could all comment and share your relative perspectives on how we might avoid that scenario and maybe what some best practices are for designing these systems ethically and with a degree of transparency and right to explanation.
Sure, well, I'll dive in to start with. So I didn't have a chance to talk about it earlier, but one of my companies, I was the chief scientist of a company called Guild, and we were one of the first to use AI for hiring. We built a database of 122 million people, covered pretty much the professional class around the world. Our data was English language biased, but had really solid representation around the world. And our goal was to take bias out of the hiring process, broadly defined. Race and gender, yes, but did you really need to go to MIT to be a qualified engineer? What is actually necessary to do the job well? And the funny thing is, if you take a very traditional, if I may say something traditional in a world where it's existed for 3 years at best, sort of approach to this problem, you might take a very big, complex, deep neural network and throw it at a ton of hiring history data. And I don't even need to build the model to tell you exactly what it would recommend. It would say hire straight white men from wealthy conservative backgrounds, because that's what history would tell it. And you'd be surprised, my board would regularly say, why don't you just predict who Facebook would hire? And it's like, have you ever seen the demographic numbers from Facebook? They're kind of atrocious. Like, clearly, there's a difference between what these systems learn to recommend and what the actual causal models are. And so, forgive me, I'm going to be a little wonky here for a moment and then hand it off. One of the core problems of artificial intelligence is that in these very complex, very large data sets, there are vastly more what I would call spurious correlations than there are actual causal relationships. And when I say more, I mean in many cases orders of magnitude more. So if you take these algorithms and you train it, who should I hire? Who carried out that crime? How should we allocate money in education or economic models? If you don't truly deeply understand the problem space that you're working in, it is overwhelmingly likely that these naive models will lie to you. They'll recommend something which is not an actual causal relationship, and you won't know the difference. And if you think I'm being ridiculous about it, when I say these systems will recommend straight white men for all the jobs, that is published, peer-reviewed research. If it got through peer review, I guarantee you it's in somebody's product right now today. And so, these things are serious problems. The one thing I will say about it before handing it off is, and I'm a little bit of an outsider on this, is the solution to this is not cleaning up your data set. Like, we know our data is biased, so let's remove the bias out of the data set. Now, your data is biased, your AI is biased from the data, and now it's also biased from you too. So in my opinion, you've actually made everything worse rather than better. So how do you represent your actual knowledge about the problems you're looking at and your uncertainty? So you build these things so that they're actually honest about what they do and don't know. So you're right, it's a huge problem, and I didn't give you a magic solution for dealing with it, but there are much better ways, quite frankly, than just hiring a bunch of really smart kids out of university that have never done anything in hiring or in criminal justice, and you imagine that they will go solve your problems for you.
So John, short of a magic solution, could you perhaps recommend some best practices? What do you think here?
Oh, I think we will be early adopters of technology. Quoting John Hagel's early speech, we will leverage the scalable learning, all the advanced external partners from Harvard partners, from Cambridge, right? Essentially, and we just help out with curate and collect the data aspect, right? Through the advancement of gene sequencer, through the advancement of the data collection on the people's behavior, food, through our retail ecosystem and retail clinics that we are planning to build. So we collect a lot of data and help with that process, leverage the expert, like Dr. Raven.
Dr. Sutapa, do you have anything to add on that?
I think both of them encapsulate sort of the problem and the best practice solutions right now. I think the only thing that I would like to add is let's go into a bigger questions of whether the machines that we're talking about would be able to understand ethical values or whether they can make a decisions on ethicals on their own. I think the problem is let's imagine yourself driving a car. Forget the driverless car. You're yourself driving a car. You have to decide whether you go to make a turn. One is the group of elderly people. Another one is a woman pushing a stroller. Any human would have difficulty making that decision. So ethics is very contextual. Is extremely different, varies from culture to culture, and even in one culture is very different from time to time. So the problem is, who would decide what the ethical rule is? Once we have the well-defined ethical rules, it's very easy to put that in AI. Programming is the easiest part. The hardest part is who decide that, or how do we work together to come up with that rules? And so far, I don't believe that we have that solutions. I think right now, there are and collaboration between the big tech giant, they call it partnership of AI, where they set up the set of guidelines for their AI researchers not to do, building weapons, doing something that, on the gray side of the ethical side of the ethical line, and those are one of the best solutions that there's present themselves in the system right now.
I mentioned that one of the very first projects I ever worked on was doing face processing, this sort of lie detection task. When we were working on that, it was about 20 years ago, there's this guy named Paul Viola who did sort of a roadshow, and he showed off the first high-quality, real-time face tracker. It was really, you could hold up a dollar bill and it would track George Washington. You could show, he'd show pictures and it would find everyone in the picture. And then he showed the crew of the Starship Enterprise, the original version of the show. And it missed one person in that crew. And you can probably guess who it is if you know anything about these technologies. It was Uhura, the black character. And he said, we understand, it was trained on the internet and the internet's overwhelmingly white. Known problem, we will fix it. Flash forward 10 years, and I'm the chief scientist at Guild, the company I just talked about. I got a call from the Wall Street Journal. Google's AI system just labeled a black couple as gorillas. Is AI racist? And I said, it's the same thing as the rest of us. It depends on how you raise it. Now flash forward 10 years again, and a paper just came out showing that if you're a light-skinned man, AI face recognition works really well. If you're a light-skinned woman, not so great. If you're a man of color, if you're a woman of color, it's not great at all. Now this is 20 years later. This is not a technical problem. This is us. We're the ones that are making this failure. And I'll tell you why we're making it. Because nobody building AI today, or very few of us, are actually concerned that our families will get labeled as gorillas. And so one of the solutions here is to really diversify the sets of people building AI. If it's the domain of young men of sort of white and East Asian backgrounds, well, they're going to build stuff that's great for them. And they're not going to do it because they're bad people. They're going to do it because they understand themselves. And if you really want to solve these problems, one of the simplest ways is have more stakeholders.
But wouldn't that be the same result as the chatbot Tay by Microsoft?
Oh,
The
God, the chatbot. That was...
The chatbot Tay, it learns everything that is said on Twitter. Right?
Yeah,
In 24
well,
hours, it's have to shut it down.
When you think about that bot, and there are some other technologies that did similar things, you train a language model on Western literature and it becomes sexist. I mean, there's all these great examples. To me, again, kind of in a way, another version of what you were talking about, this ethics question, is AI will only ever reflect our own ethics back at us. It's us. This is our decision making. One of the jobs of the future, not from my work, but from many others, is have people train AIs on ethical decisions. I don't know if that is, in fact, actually the solution. It seems like a very weird job for people to have, but, or maybe you just call that a parent. But it's an interesting thing to entertain, which is we need much more explicit models of ethics and a real decision collectively as a culture to say, like, this is something we believe is right. In fact, I'm going to extend out of your earlier question, which is, right now we're building a sort of a three-silo model of AI research, a China model, a US model, and now Europe is trying to carve out its own around data protection. What is going to be the model for Southeast Asia? This is one of the great economic engines of the world, but it's been an afterthought in this space. India is certainly going to build their own model. You should really think hard about what is going to be unique about what this region can provide that you won't get in China or the United States, and how are you going to leverage that? Because this is going to be, it's not going to be a warfare. There isn't going to be necessarily a right answer or a winner here, but there's going to be different ways that people can go about learning in these spaces, and I think there's something truly unique and special to be done here.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe there's also perhaps, building off what you said in your session, Vivian, about the idea that the vast majority of code might be written by AIs in 10 years' time. If that does indeed prove to be the case, then it almost seems like we have a limited window within which to figure out a lot of these questions before we kind of hand off the keys to self-replicating and self-extending systems. Is that a reasonable reading?
I mean, it's one interpretation of it. Certainly, we're talking about the kind of rote code that we currently pay a lot of money for, but is really, in some sense, you could hire anyone that knows how to throw together some Python. Once you have those in place and some motifs for these AIs to build off of, it maybe isn't as strong a definer of the future as you're hinting at, but it certainly begins to lay a framework where as designers are telling these computers what they want to see, and the computers are doing a lot of the coding themselves, some of this stuff you're just going to assume this is just the way it works. This is just the standard way in which programs get written. This is actually why I actually think programming jobs won't disappear. There will be these elite coders necessary to go explore new ideas and new ways of doing things. And it's the companies that figure out how to tap into that that will actually maintain leadership. Because again, that is the thing that will differentiate one company from another, its ability to tap that talent. So it would be easy to get caught in that trap, and I think many, many companies will, and maybe even cultures will. But ultimately, what I'm hoping is that the winners in this process will be the ones that invest in exploration.
John, I saw, getting back to the theme of differentiation, I saw you nodding when Vivian raised the question of might Southeast Asia perhaps carve out a different trajectory
Absolutely.
Than what's already been kind of on the table. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I find this place is very unique. Politically, it's very stable, yet somewhere between America and China, right? It's culturally, in many respects, close to China, but politically, in many respects, close to America, right? So I think in terms of adoption of technology, in terms of regulatory, in terms of, I guess, collecting data, which is unique in this region, right? And I mentioned earlier on the cash culture unique in this region as well. We could really change a lot. That is, apply AI technology specific for this region. And certainly its ethic problem is I guess it's different culture, different country, right? And also where your political system evolved. Early days adoption is considered to be illegal. Death penalty is treated unethical in some country, right? So even blood transfusion, still some religion considered to be bad, right? And so I think ethical things, it will be a separate question, not to AI specific, right? And it's people kill, not tools, and I view AI as tools, right? So I think, but here it's very unique, that's different from China and different from US. So.
How do you see this, Dr. Satapa?
Well, I think Southeast Asia it's a combination of different governments, and all these governments have different sets of rules and understanding or the openness to this data culture. And I think one thing that's made clear, it doesn't matter that it has to be one Southeast Asia version of AI development. It can be 10 different versions. But one thing that needs to be clearer is the rules of law that governs the data policy, the privacy understanding, what's open, what's doable, and right now everything is quite gray. So if you look at in the US, the rules of law is quite clear of what's allowed, what's not. China is very clear. It's going all the way to what's free for all. Let's do this. Let's try. When it's big enough, we can control that later. And European, it's swinging to the other side, right? The GDPR that came out requires rule of explanation. Rights to explanation, and that's almost working against AI itself, right? Because in AI, you would not be able to spell out how the outcome come about, and that's the magic of it. And because of the GDPR laws that's coming out, I think for Southeast Asia, looking at these different examples, we have to decide on each government of what is right. And right now, because the law is not very clear. We don't have the open data policy. So a lot of the companies that accumulate data or the government that accumulate information seems to own them and make the best decision of how to use that rather than the owner of that information themselves, which is a customer or a citizen. So I think that's something that needs to be done in order for the SMEs or the innovation that's everywhere, not just in big corporates or the government can be part of that development.
Yeah, and one thing I think has been somewhat maddening to watch in the United States is the lack of understanding and communication between the technologists driving the development of artificial intelligence systems and any kind of policymakers in U.S. government. And I'm hoping that you will be able to facilitate and see a better dialogue here. And now we only have a little bit of time left, and I have to pull the dirty trick that occasionally a moderator must pull on panelists. And because this is an SU program, I need to make sure to get a question in there about consciousness. And I know, I have to do it. So prepare yourselves for a lightning round of speculation, which I know as real scientists you're loath to do. But please, if you will, I'd like to hear from each of you. How far off do you think we might be, and or how plausible might the idea be of a conscious or human-like artificial intelligence system, or one that could fool us into thinking it were conscious?
I think AI certainly today is not self-conscious, right? But of course, it depends on somebody's definition. I heard somebody argue it's self-conscious because it's knowing its own state and knowing its own external state, right, through sensor. But does it know his own limitation? Does he know his own craving and desire? Right? Does he have high elevation of spirituality? I don't see any of this coming, right? But in future, I don't know, because if biochemical advance so much, and many of our action is biochemical induced, so I can't talk about future, but certainly it's all fake today. So.
So I'm sort of a boring, hardcore, hard numbers neuroscientist. I question whether we're conscious. Certainly, it's hard to look at any voting record of any country and consider most people to be conscious. So, but more to the specific point, a couple of people, Jeff Hinton, Michael Jordan, a bunch of really prominent people in the AI field recently have said something which I very strongly agree with, which is this current breed of artificial intelligence is just not the next stage. The way we think, and I don't want to get into specifics, is distinctly different than the way these systems do. The closest is a recent paper by the DeepMind team where it was able to look at the world and create new views and perspectives that it had never had before. That's maybe the beginnings of something interesting, but I think a huge, long way to go before anything. Having said that, I can give you a timeline as someone that builds neuroprosthetics and cybernetics when we have people that are artificially smarter than other people. And that has all of the same ethical implications associated with it.
Well, I find conscious, it's a very difficult to define concept. And in itself doesn't mean that I don't have conscience, but I just that I can't put my handle on what's defined conscience. And on that sense, it's very difficult to build that into AI nowadays. The concept of technological singularity point or artificial general intelligence is quite far-fetched at this point because a lot of AI that we see today and in the lab are trained for a specific task. And right now, I think most scientists would agree that it's quite difficult to, they still struggle to move the learning from one task and transport that and transmit that into a different kind of task. So in itself, it's very far from AGI. But I think we would definitely see more and more of what we think of a task that we think human can do, that AI can do also. For example, there's a lot more and more of AI technologies that try to identify people who are depressed or have suicidal tendency and how to be able to reach out to those people and be able to talk to them in a way that used to be helpful and satisfying only by the other human. And now AI, in the lab was trying to solve that problem. So we start to see more and more of those, and in itself, the characteristic that we see in Siri is all programmed, so they don't develop that by themselves. So it's something that we start to see more and more.
Now, we could always just decide to build all of our phones so that they beg for their life whenever you reboot them. Maybe it would go some ways to some of the famous
Fooling
Turing
us.
tests, but who knows?
Well, so it sounds like then we may still have a little bit of breathing room, a little more time as a unique intelligence in the world, but perhaps with that unique power now comes the significant responsibility of being good stewards of our artificially intelligent creations and using those, hopefully, to be good stewards of humanity and of the planet, which in itself is challenge enough without worrying about conscious AIs competing with us. So with that, I will say, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all.